The sound of the slap echoed through the marble hallway before Kim Jae-hoon even reached the door. He froze, his hand still gripping his briefcase, a leather bag worth more than most people's annual salary. When he stepped into the laundry room, the scene was a jagged tear in the perfection of his life. Serena Walker was on the floor, a heap of white linen scattered around her like fallen snow. Her dark skin was flushed with heat where his wife's fingers had left their mark. Standing over her was Min Step, her face twisted into a mask of elite cruelty that Jae-hoon barely recognized. "Stop right here. You might think you know how a billionaire reacts when his wife loses her temper, but Kim Jae-hoon is about to do something that will rewrite the laws of Seoul high society. Before we see his next move, drop a yes in the comments if you believe Serena deserves justice. Get away from her." Jae-hoon's voice wasn't a shout, it was a low, vibrating growl that cut through Min Step, screeching like a blade. Min Step didn't even look up, her hand raised for a second strike. "She's a clumsy girl, Jae-hoon. She ruined the..." He moved. In 3 strides, the man who was known for his icy detachment in the boardroom crossed the distance. He didn't grab his wife, he simply stepped between them, his broad back forming an unbreakable wall between the abuser and the victim. For the first time in 3 years of marriage, Jae-hoon looked at Serena, really looked at her. He saw the trembling in her hands, the way she tried to make herself small, and the quiet dignity she held even while broken on the floor. She wasn't just the help anymore. She was the only thing in this house worth saving. "You're fired," he whispered, but he wasn't looking at Serena. He was looking directly at his wife. "And you have 10 minutes to leave my sight." The silence in the penthouse was heavy, vibrating with the low hum of the city lights far below. Jae-hoon stood by the floor-to-ceiling window, his silhouette sharp and unyielding against the glass. He didn't turn when he heard Min Seo's uneven breathing behind him. He didn't have to, he could feel her desperation like a physical weight in the room. "Jae-hoon, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. "We can talk about this. The rumors, the photos, they aren't what they look like." He checked his watch, the movement precise and clinical. 10 minutes, Min Seo. The words were cold, devoid of the warmth that had once defined their private moments. He finally turned to face her, his dark eyes vacant of the affection she had spent 3 years trying to cultivate. In his hand, he held a sleek, black folder, the divorce papers, already signed on his end. 10 minutes, he repeated, his voice dropping an octave. "After that, my security team has instructions to escort you from the building. Anything you leave behind will be disposed of. I suggest you prioritize." Min Seo felt a chill settle in her marrow. She looked at the man she called husband and realized she was looking at a stranger. The power dynamic had shifted so violently she felt breathless. "You're throwing me out. Just like that? In the middle of the night?" "The clock is ticking," Jae-hoon said, leaning back against the mahogany desk. He looked bored, as if he were waiting for a tedious meeting to conclude rather than the end of a marriage. "You have 9 minutes left. I've already moved the settlement funds to your personal account. It is more than enough for a hotel, and frankly, more than you deserve given the circumstances." Min Seo scrambled toward the bedroom, her heels clicking frantically against the marble. The realization hit her that he wasn't bluffing. 2 large men in suits were already standing silently by the foyer entrance, their expressions as stony as his. She grabbed a suitcase from the top of the closet, her hands shaking so hard she could barely work the zipper. She threw in whatever she could reach, silk dresses, a jewelry box, a stray pair of heels, not caring that the expensive fabrics were wrinkling. Every time she glanced at the bedroom door, she saw Jae-hoon's shadow in the hallway, a dark sentinel counting down the seconds of her former life. When the 10-minute mark hit, the heavy tread of boots sounded on the hardwood. Jae-hoon appeared in the doorway, his face a mask of indifference. "Time is up," he said. Before she could zip the bag, one of the security guards stepped forward, firmly but politely taking the handle. "Wait, I didn't get my..." "Goodbye, Min Seo," Jae-hoon interrupted, turning his back on her once more. The transition was too swift, a blur of motion that left Serena's head spinning. Before the dawn could even fully claim the sky, the damp, familiar scent of the servants' quarters, mildew, old straw, and the unwashed fatigue of a dozen bodies, was replaced by something cloyingly sweet. It was the smell of lavender and expensive beeswax, the scent of a world Serena was never meant to inhabit. Two older maids, their faces set in masks of professional indifference, led her through the labyrinthine stone corridors of the estate. Every time Serena's rough, calloused heels struck the polished marble of the upper floors, the sound echoed like a gavel. She felt like a stain on the finery, a smudge of soot on a pristine canvas. When they reached the guest suite, the heavy oak doors groaned open to reveal a room larger than the entire cottage she had grown up in. Sunlight poured through floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating tapestries that depicted scenes of hunts and triumphs. In the center sat a bed draped in pale, shimmering silk, its canopy rising like the ribs of a great, silver beast. "Bathe," one of the maids commanded, gesturing toward a copper tub already steaming in the corner. "The master does not like to be kept waiting, and he certainly does not like the smell of the kitchens." Serena stood frozen as the door clicked shut. She didn't move toward the bath, instead, she retreated until her back hit the wall. The silk sheets, which should have looked like a luxury, felt like a shroud. In the servants' quarters, she was invisible, but she was safe in that anonymity. Here, in the guest suite, she was a specimen. She was being polished and preened, not for her own comfort, but to be better consumed. Her hands shook as she reached out to touch the fabric of a gown laid out on the chaise longue. It was a deep, haunting violet, the material so thin it felt like water against her skin. To the rest of the world, this was a rise in station, a rag-to-silk miracle. But as Serena looked at the heavy gold latch on the door, she realized it didn't matter how beautiful the cage was if the door was locked from the outside. The silence of the room was heavy, pressing against her ears until she could hear the frantic, uneven thrumming of her own heart. She wasn't a guest, she was a prize being prepared for a shelf. The morning light felt intrusive, cutting through the heavy velvet curtains of Jae-hoon's office like a blade. He hadn't slept, the silence of the penthouse had been replaced by the rhythmic, aggressive vibration of his phone against the mahogany desk. By 6 a.m., the headlines were unavoidable. "The chairman's domestic secret," one tabloid screamed. Another was more clinical but twice as damaging: "Ethics breach at Hansan Group, illegal employment or personal favoritism." The photos were grainy but unmistakable: Seo-yeon leaving the service entrance, a fleeting moment of her laughing at something Jae-hoon had said in the hallway. To the world, she wasn't just a maid, she was a liability, a crack in the polished armor of a multi-billion-dollar legacy. The summons to the boardroom came before his first coffee. When Jae-hoon entered the floor, the air was thick with the scent of expensive cologne and unspoken judgment. The board of directors sat like stone statues, their faces etched with the kind of pragmatism that had no room for human sentiment. The stock price dropped 4 points at the opening bell, Director Kong said, sliding a tablet across the table. His voice was dry, devoid of heat. "The public doesn't care about her work ethic, Jae-hoon. They care about the optics of a chairman harboring someone with a complicated background in his private residence. It looks like a lapse in judgment. It looks like a weakness." Jae-hoon didn't sit. He stood at the head of the table, his hands clenched behind his back. "She has done nothing wrong. The paperwork was handled." "The paperwork is irrelevant in the court of public opinion," another voice cut in. "You are the face of this company. If the face is compromised, the body suffers." The room grew silent, the kind of heavy, suffocating quiet that precedes a guillotine's fall. Director Kong leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't a suggestion, Chairman. The board demands a clean break. Terminate her employment immediately. Issue a statement saying she was a temporary contractor whose services are no longer required. If she stays in that house one more night, we will be forced to discuss a vote of no confidence." Jae-hoon felt a coldness settle in his chest. He thought of Seo Yun, how she hummed while organizing the library, how she was the only person in this city who didn't look at him and see a title. She was his sanctuary, and now, the very world he built was demanding he sacrifice her to save himself. I understand, Jae-hoon said, his voice sounding foreign to his own ears. He turned and walked out, the heavy doors thudding shut behind him like a final sentence. The antiseptic smell of the private clinic usually felt cold and clinical, but with Jae-hoon's hands on her skin, the air seemed to thicken with a heavy, unspoken heat. He hadn't called for a nurse. Instead, he had pulled the rolling stool close to the exam table, his movements methodical and quiet as he laid out the gauze and saline. Serena watched him, her breath hitching every time his fingers grazed the raw skin of her forearm. The professional wall she had carefully maintained, the one built on polite nods and business-first directives, wasn't just cracking, it was dissolving. "You should have been more careful," he murmured, his voice a low vibration that skipped across her nerves. He didn't look up, focusing instead on dabbing the wound with a gentle, agonizing precision. "I didn't think it would escalate that quickly," Serena replied, her voice sounding breathy even to her own ears. Jae-hoon paused, his thumb resting just above the bruise blooming on her wrist. The contact was unnecessary for the treatment, yet he didn't pull away. He looked up then, his dark eyes searching hers with an intensity that made the sterile room feel far too small. There was no trace of the detached executive in his gaze, only a raw, flickering concern that bordered on something much more dangerous. "Don't think," he said softly, his grip tightening almost imperceptibly. "Just let me take care of it." He moved to the small cut on her cheek. His touch was feather-light, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw to steady her face. Serena found herself leaning into the contact, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The silence between them wasn't empty, it was filled with the weight of everything they hadn't said since the gala. As he pressed a small bandage over the cut, his knuckles brushed her skin, lingering for a second too long to be accidental. The air between them sparkled with a sudden, sharp electricity. For a moment, the world outside, the scandals, the board meetings, the expectations, ceased to exist. There was only the warmth of his hands and the way he looked at her, as if she were the only thing in the room worth fixing. He finally pulled back, though he stayed within her personal space, his gaze dropping to her lips before returning to her eyes. The wall was gone, replaced by a bridge that neither of them seemed ready to cross, yet neither could turn away from. The silence of the penthouse was deceptive, a thin veil over the malice humming in Min's veins. She moved with the practiced grace of a ghost, her silk robe barely whispering against the marble floors. In her palm, the diamond necklace felt unnaturally cold, $500,000 of platinum and ice that was about to become a noose. Serena's room was a sanctuary of soft linens and the faint scent of jasmine, a purity Min intended to stain. She didn't hesitate. She crossed to the mahogany armoire, sliding a velvet-lined jewelry tray out just far enough to tuck the necklace beneath a stack of silk scarves. It was too easy. The necklace caught a stray beam of moonlight, winking at Min like a co-conspirator before she buried it back into the shadows. "Sweet dreams, Serena," Min whispered, her voice a jagged contrast to the room's tranquility. She retreated to the living room, her heart hammering a frantic, rhythmic beat against her ribs. She picked up the burner phone she'd prepared, her fingers steady despite the adrenaline. The call was brief, her voice pitched into a perfect tremolo of photosтрess. She claimed a high-value theft, an internal betrayal, and the discovery of missing heirlooms. By the time the muffled sirens began to wail in the distance, Min was seated on the designer sofa, a glass of amber scotch in her hand and a mask of devastated confusion firmly in place. When the heavy pounding echoed against the front door, the household jerked into motion. Serena emerged from her room, rubbing sleep from her eyes, her face pale and vulnerable in the harsh hallway lights. She looked small, confused by the sudden intrusion of blue and red strobes reflecting off the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Min. What's going on?" Serena asked, her voice trembling. Min didn't look at her. She kept her eyes on the officers as they crossed the threshold, her hand trembling as she pointed toward the hallway. I couldn't believe it myself. I checked the security logs, and then I saw her coming out of my vault. Please, just check her room. I want to be wrong. I pray that I'm wrong. The lead officer gave a curt nod, his boots heavy on the plush carpet as he led the team toward Serena's door. Serena stood frozen, her gaze darting between Min and the police, a slow, dawning horror breaking across her features. I didn't take anything, Serena whispered, her voice cracking. Min, tell them. Min finally looked at her, offering a gaze filled with such calculated, heartbreaking pity that it felt like a physical blow. The truth will come out, dear. It always does. The silence in the room grew heavy, the kind of weight that makes it hard to draw a full breath. Min Suk leaned against the mahogany sideboard, her knuckles white as she gripped the edge. She had spent weeks convincing herself that her private hell was exactly that, private. But Jae-hoon's expression wasn't one of suspicion, it was one of grim, absolute certainty. He didn't speak at first. Instead, he reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out a slim, black smartphone. With a few practiced swipes, he turned the screen toward her. You thought the dead zones in the hallway were enough, he said, his voice dropping to a low, vibrating register. You thought that if you stayed away from the main foyer, no one would see how he looks at you. How he treats you when the staff is dismissed. Min Suk's heart hammered against her ribs. On the screen, a grainy but clear feed flickered to life. It was a high-angle shot of the breakfast nook, a corner she thought was shielded by the decorative pillars. In the video, her husband didn't strike her, but the cruelty was visceral. He was leaning over her, his hand clamped tight around her upper arm, shaking her with a rhythmic, cold violence while she remained frozen, staring at the floor. The lack of audio made the aggression feel even more clinical, more terrifying. I installed them 6 months ago, Jae-hoon confessed, his eyes never leaving hers. Small, pinhole lenses tied to a private server. I didn't do it to spy on you, Suk. I did it because I knew the man you married wasn't the man the public sees. I needed proof of the monster. Min Suk reached out, her fingers trembling as she brushed the screen, watching her digital self cower. A hot prickle of shame rose in her throat, but beneath it was a strange, soaring sense of relief. The secret wasn't hers to carry alone anymore. He'll kill you if he finds out, she whispered, her voice cracking. Jae-hoon stepped closer, closing the gap until she could feel the heat radiating from him. He took the phone back and tucked it away, but he didn't break eye contact. He's too busy admiring his own reflection to notice the shadows. I have hours of this, Suk. Every sneer, every grab, every time he's made you feel like you're nothing. He reached out, hesitating for a fraction of a second before placing his hand over hers on the sideboard. His skin was warm, a sharp contrast to the cold marble. You aren't a victim in a silent film anymore. We have the footage. Now, we just have to decide when to hit play. The camera shutters sounded like a rhythmic barrage of gunfire, their flashes turning the dim, mahogany-paneled briefing room into a strobe-lit stage. Jae-hoon stood behind the podium, his expression an impenetrable mask of calm. To the city, he was the prodigal son caught in a scandal, to the board of directors, he was a liability that needed to be managed. But as he adjusted the microphone, there was no trace of the contrition the public expected. He didn't wait for the moderator to introduce him. He simply leaned forward, his voice steady and resonant, cutting through the chaotic murmur of the press corps. I am aware of the narratives being spun in the wake of recent events, Jae-hoon began, his gaze sweeping across the front row of reporters. There have been calls for apologies and demands for transparency. However, I am not here today to ask for your forgiveness for a life I chose to lead. I am here to clarify the foundation of my future. A ripple of confusion moved through the room. This wasn't the script of a man seeking redemption. Jae-hoon stepped slightly to the side and extended his hand toward the wings of the stage. The strength of any legacy is defined by the people who stand beside us when the world demands we fall. I would like to introduce you to the person who shares my vision and my resolve. Serena stepped into the light. She moved with a grace that felt both fragile and unbreakable, her eyes reflecting the blinding white glare of the flashes without flinching. As she took her place beside him, Jae-hoon didn't just acknowledge her presence, he took her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers in a public display of solidarity that felt like a declaration of war against his critics. "This is Serena," he said, the coldness in his tone melting into something fiercely protective. "She is not a footnote in a scandal. She is my partner. Moving forward, every decision made by this office and every venture under my name will be a reflection of our joint commitment. We are not here to satisfy your curiosity, we are here to show you that the city's expectations do not define our reality." The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the realization that the power dynamic had shifted. He hadn't silenced the rumors, he had weaponized them. By elevating Serena from a whispered secret to a public partner, he had effectively stripped the media of their leverage. They stood together, a unified front against a city that thrived on tearing people apart, leaving the reporters to scramble for questions that no longer had the power to hurt them. The heavy silence that followed the Duke's accusation was not the cooling bomb Serena had hoped for, it was a suffocating shroud. She felt the eyes of the gathered nobility boring into her, their gazes like shards of ice, expecting her to wither, to weep, or to flee. For years, she had been a shadow in the periphery, a silent vessel for their whims and a convenient target for their scorn. But as the Duke took a step toward her, his mouth curling into a sneer of practiced superiority, something within Serena finally snapped. It wasn't an explosion of rage, but a quiet, crystalline hardening of her resolve. "Enough," she said. The word was not loud, but it possessed a clarity that sliced through the murmurs of the crowd. The Duke halted, his eyebrows twitching in disbelief. Serena didn't lower her head. Instead, she straightened her spine, a gesture she had practiced in the solitude of the servants' quarters but never dared to perform in the light. "You speak of my station as if it were a stain," she continued, her voice gaining a steady, rhythmic strength. "You treat my silence as an invitation for your cruelty. But my hands, which you despise, have kept this house standing while your own have done nothing but tear others down." A gasp rippled through the gallery. Serena took a deliberate step forward, reclaiming the space that had been used to diminish her. The fear that had lived in her chest for a decade was still there, but it no longer held the reins. "I am not a victim of your narrative," she said, meeting the Duke's stunned eyes with a level gaze. "I am the woman who knows every secret of these halls, every crack in your foundation, and every lie you tell yourself to sleep at night. You cannot shame a woman who has found her own worth in the dark." She looked around the room, not with defiance, but with a profound, weary dignity. She saw the shock on the faces of the ladies-in-waiting and the sudden, flickering uncertainty in the guards. For the first time, they weren't looking at a maid, they were looking at a person. "I will not be silenced by those who are afraid of the truth," Serena concluded, her voice a soft bell in the vast hall. "I am leaving this house, but I am taking my name and my soul with me. They were never yours to keep." Without waiting for a dismissal she no longer needed, Serena turned her back on the gold and the glass. She walked toward the heavy oak doors, her footsteps echoing with the sound of a woman finally coming home to herself. The heavy iron gates of the estate didn't just close behind them, they seemed to seal away a lifetime of hierarchy and unspoken debts. As the carriage pulled away toward the sun-drenched coast of the southern provinces, the air inside felt different, lighter, stripped of the suffocating scent of beeswax and old traditions. Jae-hoon reached across the velvet seat, his hand hovering for a moment before Serena met him halfway. The title of maid had been shed like a winter coat in the first bloom of spring. It was a word that carried the weight of bowed heads and averted eyes, and as they crossed the border of the central district, Jae-hoon silently vowed it would never cross his lips again. He looked at her not as a master looking at a loyal shadow, but as a man finally seeing the world in full color. "You're quiet," he murmured, his thumb tracing the line of her knuckles. There was no command in his voice, only a soft curiosity. Serena looked out the window at the passing meadows, her reflection in the glass showing a face that no longer wore a mask of professional neutrality. "It is a strange thing," she admitted, her voice steady but warm. "To own my own time. To realize that when I wake tomorrow, the first thought I have can be my own, rather than a list of your requirements." Jae-hoon let out a short, self-deprecating laugh. "I suspect I have more to unlearn than you do. I have spent years being looked after. Now, I want to learn how to stand beside you." The kingdom they were building wasn't one of stone walls or vast territories, it was a quiet geography of shared meals and equal footing. In their new home, a modest villa overlooking the Sapphire Sea, there would be no servants' quarters and no master's study. There would only be rooms filled with light and the sound of two people discovering who they were without the scripts they had been forced to memorize. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, painting the sky in strokes of violet and gold, Jae-hoon leaned back, watching Serena. The power dynamic that had once defined them had evaporated, replaced by a fragile, beautiful seedling of mutual respect. He didn't want her devotion because it was her job, he wanted her partnership because it was her choice. "Tomorrow," she said, turning back to him with a small, genuine smile that reached her eyes, "I think I should like to walk along the shore. Not to scout the path for you, but simply to see the water." "Then we shall walk," Jae-hoon replied, squeezing her hand. "And I will try my best to keep up with you."